Hello Gainers, I'm Ralphie. Welcome to Fitter Philosophy, the practical Stoic philosophy and lifestyle channel in which I, Ralphie, having been around the block a few times in the experience of life, I'm no spring chicken, but I have spent my life observing things in more and more detail from a practical perspective, from the job I do, to the people I've met, to the amazing conversations that I've had over the years with the most interesting people that, you wouldn't believe exist, these larger-than-life characters, and they're definitely out there. And I'm sharing some of that with you because communication, exchange of information and sharing is one of the most valuable ways that we all learn in the experience of life. And at the moment we're all experiencing something in common, and that is a global pandemic. So this vlog is a continuity. It's part 2 of a 5-part series regarding 2020. And there's nothing ordinary about this year so far, and we're not even into it really, wherever we are. But the single most organised event in recent human history is taking place right now, for the simple reason technology is allowing it. And it's the technology of communication, and it's a pandemic. It's certainly interesting that people are now comparing the death rate figures before and after the pandemic has started with what has been historical in recent years, and they're discovering that there's really not much of a difference. Now, one of the reasons for this could be very simple, and that is the effectiveness of the pandemic close down of contact and human activity and all the rest of it, which has contained the worst effects of the COVID-19 virus. And that's got to be factored in. There's also the fact that perhaps for the first time the COVID-19 coronavirus is being proactively addressed, whereas previously in recent years the flu epidemic would come round globally, it would remain unnamed, unidentified and unresponded to, and it would simply be absorbed into what the politicians in Britain anyway call herd immunity. And you can see the logic of that, and it's something that I can actually contribute to in terms of perspective. As a funeral director in Glasgow for over 20 years, and I distinctly remember in 1989, there was a massive surge in the death rate. And although reading the death certificates, which I had access to, it would say more often than not myocardial infarction, which basically is medical term for the heart stops beating. It was a situation which was not normal. And there has been many versions of that 1989 situation since, and I'm sure that it wasn't just restricted to Britain, it would be global, because viruses transmit so readily, particularly in the modern age of aircraft and ships and the swift, coordinated grouping of human activity. So I think that also that this pandemic, the organisation of it, is actually quite a timely dress rehearsal for something potentially worse in the future. Is it a man-made virus? Is it been genetically modified, or is it natural? Well, it's very easy to speculate in that, and many people do. But I really, to be honest, I cannot tell. And what we've got to be aware of as Stoic philosophers is to be careful with all the information we're surrounded with, is to go in the information we've got, because when we start to speculate imaginatively, we can perhaps keep us going to more impractical sources of information that we create for ourselves, and with that comes along misinformation and self-delusion. So it's stepping back from the situation and being a little bit more dispassionate on our personal overview. And one of the ways that the Stoic philosopher, that's you and I, folks, is going to address this is to seize the positive after examining all the negatives. And keep it in the more positive, because rest assured, as many as the millions and billions of people around the planet who will be suffering directly, indirectly from the results, or knowing people who may have this virus, there's also the passengers that come along with this virus that affect everybody, and one of them's stress. And you can already see that people are rushing to the chemist shop, the pharmaceutical companies, to get things to relieve stress, chemicals to relieve stress. I would suggest be very careful what you consume with. When it comes to prescription medication in particular, be guided by your doctor and consume what you need to consume rather than what you think you want to consume, because there is a huge amount of toxicity in unrequired medications, and as much as people will make themselves sick or be made sick from a virus, there's a lot more people going to be made sick by being cooped up inside houses all day, every day, with relatives which are not necessarily people they actually get on well with, particularly when you've got the kids going stir crazy, and people are getting stressed out their box. And some people will be turning to alcohol, other people will be overeating, people will be bored, they'll be too inactive, and therefore I highly recommend that if you have the opportunity, make full use of your daily isolated exercise. I'll tell you something else that you want to make full use of. And as to a certain extent, the forward-looking of us have planned for this. We've anticipated this moment, and that is having more time in our hands. This is a huge and valuable resource. My heart goes out to those who are self-employed and can no longer operate the business, particularly if they're owing debt. That's the critical thing. But rather than be overwhelmed by the negativity of our situations, which vary between individuals, it is well worth stepping aside, taking the big deep breaths to calm down and examining the positive the situations we have. And one of the positives is that I have got a big pile of books that I've been buying over the years under the philosophy that someday I'll have time to read these books, because I'll make the time to read these books. But I've been leafing through the books and thought, this is a really interesting book. And here's one, I want to introduce it to you. And this is where I'm going to conclude my video now. This is a book that I bought at a car boot sale back in the 1980s. Now, the 1980s is about 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And I was leafing through it, and something told me that this book was really interesting. It had a lot to tell me, and it only cost 50 pence. So, I mean, a very, very small amount of money, because you can buy a lot of second-hand books in good condition for pennies, and the value of the information in them far surpasses anything you're going to get from the propaganda portals that are newspapers, a lot of magazines, and television. In fact, if you want to de-stress, don't buy newspapers and switch off your television. That is a very important step of progress to help de-stress yourself in the pandemic situation, in this global lockdown. But we have time, because we're making the time to look at the world around us, meditate a little, be full of our own mindfulness, and in other words, using Stoic techniques to better ourselves. And reading books is one of these useful, genuinely useful, relaxing, de-stressing things that we can do. Now, this book, nobody's ever heard of it. It's called Your Daily Food, Recipe for Survival by Doris Grant. As you can see from the cover, it's very 1970s when it was originally published. Now, Doris, bless her, is a bit of an academic. And what Doris is doing is she is highlighting using empirical data. Now, this is basically quotes and data and statistics provided by leading international academics. It's what's called empirical data. In other words, it's tried and tested and it's reputable. And what she is telling us is that there are certain foodstuffs that are prominent in our diets, such as white bread and refined white crystallized sugar. And she's highlighting just how dangerous and destructive. And at one point in this book, using her academic data, she suggests, with evidence, that up to 80% of all contemporary, what are called Western world diseases, now bear in mind, 80% is a huge amount, are due to the toxins and the chemicals and the processings and the lack of nutrition and suitability of a lot of the foodstuffs we buy. Now, this coincides with the fact that I now have time and a bit of a garden, gainers, to be more serious about growing my own food. I don't have a huge space. It's actually quite small, but a small space can be very productive. And there's certain vegetables that we can grow that are more what you'd call bulletproof. They're self-disease resistant. They're continually replenishing their value as a foodstuff as they grow. And one such is foodstuff is spinach. And I'm growing beans. I'm growing some cabbages, although they will need to be covered with a net to save them from the butterflies that plant their eggs in them. So inevitably, as I grow my own food, I will use some moderate amount of chemicals. But the thing is, to keep the flies off and the bugs. But to be honest, I'm in control of it. I see what's going into my food. And that really matters. So, and I don't know if you'll find this particular book, but if you go online, you'll find plenty of other books out there that are similar to it. Because books are the most valuable, reliable source of genuine survival information that are useful to you and I, because as gainers, we go through life gaining all the time, making gains on the gains we've already made, because that is the purpose of life, is to experience the journey and grow from that journey. Do you know, I'd love to read you a bit from this book, but for example, here's just a little snippet. Whole wheat bread and resistance to infection and disease. When we use whole grains, naturally sourced, that are not GMO, and nothing wrong with GMO, by the way. The problem with GMO is the purpose of it. GMO for resistance to poisons, which are then transferred to us. Think about it, gainers. The more that we are poisoned by the food we eat and the water we drink with fluoride, I know there's going to be comments. But you've got to examine empirical evidence, suppressed empirical evidence. It's all out there. It's there to be found. Let's go for it. But it's suggesting here in the book, in fact, it's stating here in the book, that in the processing of grains, essential nutrients are removed. For example, B1. And with whole wheat bread, in fact, bread that we can make ourselves, and the kids love making bread. And it's so much more nutritious than making cakes, particularly when they put the seeds in and they see the yeast working, or the sourdough, or however you're going to do it. And the increased nutritional value of homemade whole grain bread is exponentially higher than in long life processed white bread, which you can leave in the shelf. Try it, because you've got time. Leave it in the shelf, and you will not see it rot. You will not see it decay. Commercial white processed bread will last for months because the preservatives in it keep it. They have basically embalmed that food, figuratively speaking. But I think that's enough for one video. Thanks for watching, gainers. Please subscribe if you haven't. Click like if you like. Leave a comment. You're welcome to do so. And I will leave you with this beautiful view behind me, because when you're in a countryside environment, you're allowed out one time a day to get your exercise. And important about exercise is walking and fresh air. You cannot underestimate that value of that. So if you're in a flat somewhere, if you're really locked down in a city, at least open your windows, because the air that's going to come in that window is going to be a hell of a lot fresher than there was a few weeks ago. Just saying.